As a child, I was always very interested in nature and animals. And I had the great fortune of having a mother who's a travel agent and a father who traveled a lot for business. And so my family prioritized travel growing up. I was especially interested in reptiles and amphibians. And when I would look at my books, I would see that kind of the greatest diversity of reptiles and amphibians were in the rainforest. And so I would always try to get my parents to take me to the rainforest. And when I was 12, I finally had that opportunity. So we went to the Ecuadorian Amazon and stayed in a fairly traditional indigenous community right next to one of the most biodiverse parks in the world, Yasuni. And so that was a really special experience for me. I played with the kids my age. I saw all sorts of amazing frogs and lizards. When I came back home a few months later, there was a story in the San Francisco Chronicle about an oil spill that happened upriver from where I had been. And so when I read about that, I wondered what had happened to my friends in the forest and the animals and how they were affected by this oil spill. So that's what moved me from someone who was interested in frogs and lizards to tracking environmental issues. The thing that actually moved me to take action happened a few years later when I was in high school. So I had this opportunity to go to Malaysian Borneo, truly a spectacular place. I had just a remarkable trip where I saw incredible wildlife. I came back, I kept in correspondence with the scientists there, and several months later I learned that forest had been pulped to make paper, and now it's an oil palm plantation. And so when that forest was destroyed, it inspired me to try to do something to raise awareness about tropical forests. So when I was in college, I began writing a book about rainforests, why they're important and why we needed to save them. And thanks to having some credit from high school, I was able to finish college a year early. I spent that year finishing the book. I found a publisher. It went through peer reviews. Publisher said it was interested in publishing the book, but because it was an academic press, it didn't have the budget to put pictures in it. So they were envisioning publishing a textbook, essentially. And to me, that really defeated the purpose of what I was trying to do, which was to inspire people to care about rainforests. After all, without photos, how could you sort of convey that message? And so I decided that, I didn't write that book for money, I wrote it for impact. And so I put the text of the book online so people could read it for free. And I named it Mongabay, which is derived from the name of an island off Madagascar. So I chose that name because it was totally unique. But the reality was I wasn't going to run a website for a living, so I began, I got a real job and started doing that. But I kept working on the website nights and weekends. A few years later, I decided to quit my job and pursue my passion, and that was really where Mongabay was born. So what distinguishes Mongabay from other outlets in the world is really our focus on biodiversity. So I like to say that we focus on the intersection of people and nature, but that lens really lends well to focusing on biodiversity in the world's richest countries. So we're focusing on tropical forests, oceans, and other ecosystems where you have a very high richness of plants and animals. We also look at how indigenous local communities intersect with nature. And so I think that this focus gives us a pretty unique place in the world. There are many outlets that are covering a wide range of issues, but the fact that we are day in and day out covering these topics on an international scale rather than just in one country puts us in a pretty unique position. Another thing that makes us different is that we're publishing in multiple languages. And so what that does, it allows us to work with local reporters and get those angles that a lot of other outlets that may just have journalists in one country aren't able to get. And so those are the things that I feel really distinguish Mongabay from a lot of other outlets out there. I think the reason Mongabay has been successful is our dedication on covering a very specific topic. And so what that does, it means that a lot of our staff are very mission driven. They're just very passionate about covering issues at the intersection of people and nature. Another thing that's been quite valuable is our willingness to adapt. So been doing this for almost 25 years now, and there have been a lot of changes in the way that people consume and use information. And so if Mongabay had just used the same approach during that whole period and not been responsive to these changing trends, I think we would have had a lot more trouble. And so our willingness to adapt as needed has been very important for our success. I would also say that our focus on impact has been very helpful. So it's one thing to do journalism, which is really critical, but then also try to capture what sort of things in the world does that journalism contribute to. So when we do this reporting, what happens afterwards? And so being able to have a system to capture that information and then report it back to our supporters is very valuable. It also helps us attract more support. And so those are some of the reasons I think that Mongabay has been successful and has been able to grow from just being me in my pajamas in my apartment to this international organization with almost 100 staff now. Mongabay primarily focuses coverage on the world's most biodiverse countries. The reason we do that is we want to do reporting where we feel like we can have a marginal impact. So places like the United States, there's a lot of biodiversity, but there's also a lot more environmental coverage relative to a place like Ghana or Malaysia. And so we feel that if we want to really contribute to addressing these issues, shining a light on the places where there's the most biodiversity, there's the highest degree of threat, the greatest rate of change, and also opportunities to do journalism are ways that we can have impact in the real world. So our approach is really focused on the tropics. So specifically places that we call impact geographies, where we feel like journalism can actually inform decision making when it comes to natural resources and protecting nature. Mongabay has never had a physical office. We've always been a virtual enterprise. This was very useful when the pandemic occurred because it didn't necessarily disrupt our operations as much as it did for the traditional news outlet or even the traditional business. The advantage of this model is it's allowed us to build out a network of both staff, but also local contributors all around the world. So in terms of our staffing, we have about 100 staff now in more than 25 countries. And then we have about 1,000 contributing journalists across about 70 countries. The value of this approach is it allows us to have very localized coverage. So we can develop those narratives around people in the field, really first person narratives, the human interest stories that are relevant for the local reporting, and then have them bubble up into these global stories that span countries. So this approach has worked really well for us. It's also allowed us to be multilingual. In terms of the downsides, it does make it harder to collaborate. We have built a virtual newsroom that works well, but still it's not quite the same as having face-to-face meetings. That being said, our bureaus do often have face-to-face meetings. So, for example, we have an Indonesia bureau with more than a dozen people in Indonesia, and they typically get together a few times a year to really, collaborate and have those in-person experiences. And that also extends to some of our other bureaus as well. But overall, I would say, despite the downsides, the virtual model has really served Mongabay well. A key part of Mongabay's role in the world is serving as a bridge between the scientists doing the work and the conservationists in the field and the general public. We found that there's often a degree of translation or distillation that's really important for taking those sometimes relatively technical findings and putting them in context so that they are relevant and accessible for other audiences. A lot of scientists write in a technical way, or the topics they are covering are, or they're doing research on, are a little bit abstract. And so by having real world examples and adding narrative and color, it can really help the average person understand why they should care about this research. So Mongabay's role in this space is as a communicator of science, and it's really an important role that I feel that I feel like we fill in this area. One of the major focal areas of Mongabay's coverage is reporting on the environmental impacts on local communities. And one of my favorite examples of this is from a couple of years ago, where one of our local correspondents did a story about a community in the West African nation of Gabon. So in this case, this community of Masaha had been managing their ancestral forest for generations in a state where there was a lot of biodiversity and it was a very functional ecosystem. A Chinese logging company was then granted a logging concession within their ancestral forest. And so this could be potentially very damaging for biodiversity, but also the community's livelihoods. So we got wind of this development, and our local correspondent did this reporting, and it caught the attention of the environment minister of Gabon. And so he went to go visit the community. And originally it was supposed to be a short visit, but it ended up becoming a multi-day visit. Afterwards, the Gabonese government revoked the operating permit of this logging company. So the reason, and recognized this community reserve as the first ground-up community reserve in Gabon. So the reason that's important is it set a precedent for a bottom-up conservation model in Gabon, where most conservation had traditionally been top-down. And so that was just a really exciting and tangible impact related to one of our stories. Another example of some reporting that we did that had an impact on a community was in the country of Indonesia. So Indonesia has a program called the Plasma Scheme, where local communities are supposed to benefit when their land is converted to an oil palm plantation. So over the course of I think it was a 2-year investigation, which Mongabay did in collaboration with the BBC and the Gecko Project, we found that a lot of those benefits weren't actually returning to local communities. So after we did this investigation, one of the most senior finance ministers in Indonesia announced that they were going to do an investigation into this issue in order to try to ensure that more of those benefits actually reach those communities that have lost access to their land. Another recent example where Mongabay's reporting focused on the environmental impacts on a local community was in Brazil. So one of our investigative reporters went to the Amazon and reported on water pollution from an oil palm plantation that affected a local community. After that reporting came out, the public prosecutor announced an investigation into what had gone on with this oil palm plantation. And now there's a court case. So there's a potential where this community may receive some sort of remuneration or resolution to this issue that's been plaguing their community for a long time. So at Mongabay, we really like to see it when our journalism can inform decision makers and lead to real world change. So one of the things about facing these many environmental challenges, from climate change to biodiversity loss, is the effects of this damage is becoming more and more apparent to everyone. So therefore, it's becoming more relevant in our daily lives. And so from this standpoint, it's both making environmental journalism more important, but also expanding the potential audience for our reporting. So people want to understand why this is happening and what we can do about it. And that is something that Mongabay and other journalism outlets can do. So we can connect the science to the things that people see in their everyday lives. And that's an absolutely critical role for journalism. It's also easy to get very discouraged by some of these trends. Again, climate change, environmental degradation are having major impacts on people, very detrimental impacts on their lives. And they want solutions. And so reporting on how we can respond to these issues in order to try to shift things towards a more sustainable model is really important, both for inspiring action, but also for giving people hope. So again, the role of environmental journalism as we start to face these crises more and more is absolutely critical and is a really important reason why people should support environmental journalism. One of the most critical ingredients of successful environmental journalism is a strong basis in fact. So that means bringing in the science and conveying it in a way that makes it accessible for target audience to understand. Because if the science remains in the hands of only a few people, it can't inspire action. It doesn't help people understand what's happening in the world. There's all these things, all these negatives that result from lack of access to this information, especially in a world where disinformation is becoming more and more widespread. But beyond just connecting people to the facts and explaining, the science and the origin of this work, it's also important to create a connection between what's happening in the world and people's everyday lives. So that means the human connection. So what are the stories behind the impacts of climate change? Or what are the effects of deforestation in local communities? So bringing that human interest can be a really important way to connect people to the world around them. And so I feel that is something that's is an absolutely critical ingredient as well in doing good environmental journalism. So one of the key ways to reaching a large audience in your environmental news coverage is creating compelling and interesting visuals that connect people to the issues, but also attract their attention. So again, this is a basic communication thing, but helping people understand these complex scientific concepts in a way that it's relevant for them, but also interesting. So beyond the narrative, beyond getting the science right, really creating those visuals to bring people along on the journey, so they can understand what's going on, but also care why it's relevant to them. In recent years, environmental problems have been getting more and more visibility in the press. There's a pretty basic reason for this. It's because environmental degradation is reaching a point where we're seeing the impacts more and more regularly on a first-hand basis. So what that means is we're seeing the impacts of extreme weather. We're seeing rising temperatures from climate change or deforestation, depending on the context. We're seeing the effects of pollution. But what that means is these issues are more and more relevant to people on an everyday basis. And essentially what that is doing is creating a larger audience for environmental content. So that increases the pressure on environmental journalists to get the story right. Be sure that the reporting we're doing is fact-based, but also just be going beyond the getting the facts right is ensuring that the narrative brings people along on the journey and they care about these things, especially in the face of rising disinformation. So we have to be sure as environmental journalists that people not only trust us as delivering factual information, but that we're even able to engage people to get their attention and help them understand why they should care about these things. And given that a lot of environmental problems are so depressing, showing that there are solutions that are possible in the world and giving people hope, but real hope that's founded in facts and science, not misleading anyone. So all these are reasons why environmental journalism is just so critical today. The extent of environmental problems today can certainly be very depressing. We're hearing about the extinction crisis, the impact of climate change, worsening air pollution, worsening water pollution, plastics. I mean, it feels like a never-ending onslaught of bad news. And I've seen this firsthand with Mongabay, where I've had in the past people tell me that Mongabay is very depressing, which I totally acknowledge. And so there is this risk of environmental journalism leading people down a path where they feel like they're hopeless and cannot do anything. At Mongabay, we're trying to address that issue by intentionally focusing more on solutions coverage. So we're still doing conventional coverage, but scaling up our solutions journalism. And so this is journalism focused on solutions that are real. So it's not greenwashing. These are things that are actually being done in the world to address environmental challenges. And I believe this is really critical because it's very easy for people to get burned out on the bad news and lose any sense of hope. And so at Mongabay, the way we've done this is we've developed a few solutions-based reporting projects. For example, looking at indigenous-led conservation. So with our global network of reporters, we've done a deep dive on this issue, producing hundreds of stories of essentially these case studies of indigenous and local communities that are doing things to protect nature and steward resources. And the feedback we get is very positive. We have another series looking at agroecology. So agroecology and regenerative agriculture. So what are ways that we can change our food systems so that they help restore nature and restore nutrients rather than being extractive? We have another project that's looking at how technology can help make conservation more effective. So that could be things like satellites monitoring forests or oceans and helping us understand where change is happening so that we can potentially take action. So these are all just examples of solutions reporting, which I feel like is really important so people don't lose hope. So as you start to address an environmental issue, it can have these knock-on effects that benefit a wider range of people. So for example, protecting forests has all these benefits besides just sequestering carbon. You're helping the water cycle. You're helping local people generate local livelihoods. You're reducing ambient air temperatures. So helping people understand how these things all fit together can be a way to can be a positive thing rather than just focusing on the negative. Another thing to think about is that we talk about tipping points, ecological tipping points. They tend to be negative. The Amazon collapsing, glaciers and sea ice melting. But there are also positive tipping points. So technological advances that can transform how we move around or how we produce electricity. And so those are happening as well. So highlighting the fact that there are positive developments in addition to those negative elements, these countervailing trends that are positive for protecting nature and the sustainability of our economy and how we live. So it is important to cover those things in addition to covering the negative. Fake news is a major problem. It's probably one of the greatest threats to journalism generally, but certainly for Mongabay. The first thing is it's really important to acknowledge the seriousness of fake news and how the knock-on effects, negative effects of the degradation of the information ecosystem. It's not only that people don't know what's real anymore, but also that they may not care. And so our role as journalists is to ensure that our information is fact-based, to help people understand where that information is coming from. So the process of the journalism to show that, to show its credibility and that we have integrity. So those are absolutely critical components to helping address this issue. Another thing to be aware of is that a lot of people are tuning out from news. And so finding the aspects of environmental degradation that may affect them, like why should they care about these issues? So people may not believe in climate change, but they may understand the concept of air pollution and why that's bad for you. And so you can talk about climate through a health lens to reach certain audiences. Political polarization is a real issue today. It's something that's very challenging from an environmental standpoint because a lot of people who identify as being on the right of the political spectrum aren't interested in environmental content, or they don't believe that environmental problems are real. And so the way that we've been addressing this issue is by focusing on the aspects of environmental degradation that are relevant to people across political spectrum. So essentially broadening the constituency around environmental issues. So for example, food and water security are, as an issue, as a collective issue, is a way where you can broaden the constituency around environmental issues because nature underpins the provision of water and food security. Another major issue is like health. So when you have wildfires, it has detrimental impacts on local health. Another angle to look at is economics. So for example, in Indonesia, there have been studies that show that when you convert a natural forest to oil palm plantation, there's a significant increase in the ambient air temperature. And so if you're living in the tropics and the air temperature increases significantly, it makes it hard to work during the day. So there's an impact on local livelihoods from this environmental degradation. So their overall message is a way that you can cut through political polarization is by focusing on issues that are relevant to certain audiences. Another way to help navigate polarization is through human interest stories. So people, again, may not care about environmental issues, but they may be interested in how a local person is affected by these issues or how they're responding to them. And then another way to help bridge or address political polarization is by focusing on solutions. So a lot of people get tired of the negative news, but if you focus on ways that people are working to solve these problems, that's much more hopeful and inspirational, and that can reach people across the political spectrum. So one of the reasons that I'm hopeful for addressing the environmental crisis is that the effects of environmental degradation are just more and more apparent to everyone. And so what that means is that we're seeing the real economic costs of inaction. And so I feel that once there's enough of an economic incentive to address these problems, it will lead people to actually take action. It also can mobilize people to care about these issues and put pressure on politicians. Another reason that I'm hopeful is around innovation and technology. So with the the improvements with remote sensing, so satellites, ground-based sensors, we have a much better idea of what's happening in the world around us. So what that means is we no longer have ignorance as an excuse for not taking action. It's really political will. So there are opportunities to act, and that does make me hopeful that we will act. Lastly, I think there are concrete examples of success stories. So there are things being done in the world that are very hopeful and inspirational and show that change can happen, and it can happen quickly and have real impact in the world. So those are all things that give me hope, despite all the challenges we face.